The Supremacy Coalition had, in their infinite wisdom and finite imagination, established themselves as the galaxy's self-appointed arbiters of technological sophistication. This was a task they approached with the enthusiasm of a tax collector and the subtlety of a supernova, creating bureaucratic protocols for everything from proper plasma rifle maintenance to the appropriate number of decimal places required when calculating hyperspace jump coordinates. Their latest obsession involved what they termed primitive elimination protocols, a delightfully euphemistic way of describing their systematic program to identify, catalog, and quietly erase any species that failed to meet their exacting standards of technological achievement. It was quality control on a galactic scale, administered by beings who had apparently confused advanced with unnecessarily complicated, and decided that any civilization that couldn't split atoms for breakfast was clearly taking up valuable space in the universe. The coalition operated under the fundamental principle that technological advancement followed a linear progression from crude to sophisticated, with themselves naturally representing the pinnacle of development. They measured progress in quantum fluctuations per nanosecond, evaluated civilizations based on their ability to manipulate exotic matter, and considered any species that still used physical tools to be roughly equivalent to particularly clever bacteria. This worldview had served them well for approximately 3,000 years, during which they had systematically absorbed, eliminated, or quarantined every species they encountered. Their track record was perfect, their confidence absolute, and their humility roughly equivalent to that of a black hole, which is to say, completely absent and capable of warping reality around itself through sheer gravitational arrogance. Battle Station Dominion Prime hung in the void like a crystalline monument to over-engineering, its surface bristling with enough sensor arrays, weapon systems, and decorative lighting to power a small star system. The station's designers had apparently decided that subtlety was for species that lacked the technological sophistication to make their architecture actively painful to observe from multiple dimensions simultaneously. At the station's core lay the evaluation chamber, a vast arena designed specifically for the Coalition's favorite pastime. Watching primitive species humiliate themselves against impossible challenges before being classified as developmentally insufficient and scheduled for quiet extinction. The chamber's walls were lined with monitoring equipment so advanced that it could measure the quantum state of individual photons, track probability fluctuations across parallel dimensions, and determine the exact moment when hope died in a contestant's eyes. General Crix Nat surveyed the chamber from his command platform, his chitinous carapace gleaming with biomechanical enhancements that had cost more than most civilizations' annual energy budgets. As a member of the Kethmori warrior caste, Crix Nat resembled what might happen if someone crossed a particularly aggressive lobster with a military academy's worth of tactical doctrine, and then gave the result delusions of grandeur. His species had evolved on a world where warfare was a geological force, where continental drift was determined by the outcomes of strategic battles, and where the concept of overkill was considered a quaint philosophical notion practiced by civilizations that lacked proper commitment to problem solving. They had joined the coalition primarily because it gave them access to bigger weapons and more sophisticated targets. Today's assessment promises to be educational, Crix Nat announced to his fellow observers, his voice carrying the sort of confidence typically reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. His mandibles clicked with anticipation as he reviewed the data on their latest test subject, a recently discovered species called humans, who had somehow managed to achieve primitive spaceflight, despite still using chemical rockets and thinking that nuclear fusion was impressive. Professor Yelmoth's plasma form writhed with academic excitement, her energy matrix fluctuating through spectrums that made theoretical physicists weep with joy and divided by or existential terror. She was what passed for a materials scientist among the Pyrothian collective, though scientist was perhaps too generous a term for someone whose research methodology consisted mainly of apply more exotic energy until something interesting happens, and if it doesn't work, try adding antimatter. Her people had long ago transcended the need for physical forms, existing instead as coherent energy patterns held together by quantum will and aggressive electromagnetic fields. They communicated through controlled fusion reactions and considered solid matter to be a quaint reminder of their primitive past, like baby pictures or embarrassing poetry written during adolescence. The new void steel composite represents the absolute pinnacle of materials engineering, she proclaimed, her voice emerging from carefully modulated plasma discharges that turned the air around her into a light show. Its molecular structure exists in a state of quantum superposition across 47 dimensions simultaneously. The probability of any conventional weapon penetrating its matrix approaches mathematical impossibility. Chief Evaluator Blextor's gelatinous form pulsed with bureaucratic satisfaction as he reviewed the assessment protocols on his biological datapad, a living organism that his species had bred specifically for information storage and retrieval. Blextor's people had achieved the evolutionary pinnacle of administrative efficiency by essentially becoming living spreadsheets, their entire biology dedicated to the collection, analysis, and categorization of data. His species existed in a state of perpetual bureaucratic ecstasy, finding spiritual fulfillment in the proper filing of forms and achieving something approaching religious transcendence when they successfully cross-referenced data across multiple taxonomic systems. They had joined the coalition because it provided them with an endless supply of species to catalog, classify, and reduce to statistical abstracts. According to Protocol 1247C, subsection 43, Blextor announced in the measured tones of someone who had never encountered a situation that couldn't be improved with additional paperwork, any species demonstrating insufficient technological sophistication will be classified as evolutionarily stagnant and subjected to immediate containment protocols. Their development will be terminated to prevent contamination of the galactic technological ecosystem. The testing chamber itself was a masterpiece of intimidating architecture. The walls rose in impossible angles that seemed to fold back on themselves, creating the optical illusion that the space was simultaneously vast and claustrophobic. At the chamber's center stood their pride and joy. A humanoid target constructed entirely from void steel composite, the Coalition's latest contribution to the field of materials so advanced that we're not entirely sure what they do, but they certainly look impressive while doing it. Void steel had been developed through centuries of competitive overachievement among the Coalition's member species. Each civilization had contributed their most ridiculous technological advances, quantum-locked molecular bonds that existed in multiple realities simultaneously, self-repairing crystalline matrices that convinced damaged atoms they had never been harmed, and probability manipulation fields that could retroactively prevent damage by editing local timeline configurations. The result was a material that existed in a state of aggressive denial about the possibility of being damaged, maintained its structural integrity through what could only be described as weaponized stubbornness, and had once been observed to repair itself by traveling backward in time to prevent the damage from occurring in the first place. It was, by every conceivable measure, absolutely indestructible, which made what was about to happen particularly satisfying from the universe's perspective, assuming the universe had a sense of humor and a particular fondness for cosmic irony. The contestants had been arriving throughout the morning, each one representing their species' finest military traditions and most advanced weapon technologies. First was Zekthor of the Plasma Dominion, whose people had mastered the art of weaponizing stellar fusion. His rifle could theoretically punch holes through small planets, assuming small planets were inconsiderate enough to stand still while being shot at with the concentrated fury of dying stars. Next came Battle Sage Renkel, whose gravity lance could manipulate local spacetime to the point where hitting something became a quaint understatement for convincing reality to edit out the target's existence. Her people didn't so much fight wars as they did negotiate with the fundamental forces of the universe until their enemies agreed to stop existing in such an inconvenient manner. Then there was Destroyer Mektar, carrying what appeared to be a briefcase but was actually a portable singularity generator. His species had long ago decided that the concept of proportionate response was for civilizations that lacked proper imagination. The device could, in theory, convert the entire testing chamber into a localized black hole, which seemed like the sort of solution his people would consider measured and restrained. And finally, looking distinctly out of place among these paragons of technological warfare, stood Tobias Crawford. Tobias was human, which meant he looked like someone had taken the galaxy's basic template for standard bipedal mammal and forgotten to add any interesting features. No chitinous armor, no energy matrix body, no probability manipulation organs, no exotic matter manipulation appendages. Just a simple bipedal organism in what appeared to be basic textile coverings, holding what any reasonable observer would identify as a piece of shaped wood. Well, calling it shaped wood was perhaps unfair to the craftsmanship involved. It was clearly a javelin, crafted from some form of organic plant matter with a fire-hardened tip that showed evidence of careful manual preparation. It was, by any technological standard, an artifact from the prehistoric era. The sort of thing that belonged in a museum exhibit titled Primitive Hunting Implements of Pre-Industrial Species, right next to displays of stone axes and examples of crude metallurgy. General Cricksnat's mandibles clicked with barely restrained amusement as he observed the human representative. "The subject has arrived equipped with processed vegetation," he announced, his tone suggesting he was describing something he'd found stuck to his boot after walking through a particularly disreputable part of the galaxy. Professor Yelmoth's plasmaform flickered with harmonic laughter, her energy matrix pulsing through frequencies that suggested she found the situation roughly as threatening as a gentle breeze. Sensor analysis indicates the implement is composed entirely of organic cellulose fibers and trace carbon deposits from thermal treatment. The technological sophistication level is quaint. According to my preliminary assessment, Chief Evaluator Blextor added with the sort of precise bureaucratic satisfaction that came from properly categorizing inferior specimens. This weapon configuration was documented among human populations approximately 60,000 of their orbital cycles ago. They appear to have made no significant improvements to the basic design parameters. Tobias, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by their commentary. He stood with the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades working outdoors, solving practical problems through observation and experience rather than theoretical modeling and computer simulation. His javelin rested casually in his grip, and he surveyed the testing chamber with the sort of calm assessment that came from a lifetime of reading natural signs and understanding how systems actually worked rather than how they were supposed to work according to textbooks. The irony, of course, was that Tobias Crawford had never wanted to be here. 3 months ago, he'd been contentedly managing a national forest preserve in the Rocky Mountains, tracking wildlife migration patterns and maintaining hiking trails with the sort of quiet satisfaction that came from work that actually mattered. Then the aliens had arrived. Earth's governments had collectively panicked, and somehow his name had ended up on an extremely short list of humans deemed representative of human technological achievement. The selection process had been characteristically bureaucratic. Earth's leaders had initially wanted to send their most advanced military units, equipped with humanity's latest weapons technology. The aliens had politely declined, explaining that their assessment required each species to demonstrate their native technological development without outside assistance or modern innovations. This had led to a somewhat frantic search for someone who could represent humanity's authentic technological trajectory using tools and techniques that predated modern industrial civilization. After considerable debate and several interdisciplinary conferences, they'd settled on Tobias, largely because his background in wilderness management and traditional outdoor skills represented one of humanity's longest continuous technological traditions. The fact that he'd also served in the military before becoming a forest ranger was considered a bonus, though Tobias suspected the real reason for his selection was that everyone else had declined the assignment with varying degrees of politeness and divided by or profanity. "Attention participants," General Cricksnat's voice echoed through the chamber's acoustic enhancement systems. "You will now demonstrate your species' technological capabilities against our void steel composite target. Each participant will have one opportunity to engage the target using their chosen implement. Performance will be evaluated based on energy output, material penetration depth, and overall technological sophistication. What he didn't mention, because it would have spoiled the entertainment value, was that the evaluation was largely ceremonial. The Voidsteel target had been tested against everything from planet crackers to weapons that operated by convincing matter to reconsider its commitment to existing. Nothing had so much as marked its surface. The real value lay in watching primitive species exhaust themselves against an impossible challenge before accepting their inevitable classification as technologically insufficient. Zekthor stepped forward first, his plasma rifle charging with the distinctive whine of contained stellar fury. His people, the Plasma Dominion, had built their entire civilization around the principle that any problem could be solved with sufficient application of nuclear fire. Their weapons were marvels of fusion engineering, capable of reaching temperatures that made the cores of blue supergiants look pleasantly cool by comparison. The rifle discharged with a sound like the universe having a migraine. A beam of pure plasma, magnetically contained and accelerated to significant fractions of light speed, struck the Voidsteel target with enough energy to vaporize a small moon. The chamber's sensors registered temperatures approaching 200,000 degrees Celsius and energy outputs equivalent to a modest stellar flare. The Voidsteel target absorbed the blast, with the casual indifference of a mountain observing a light drizzle. Zekthor stared at his weapon's energy readouts, ran through several diagnostic protocols, and fired again with identical results. The target showed no signs of damage, no evidence of thermal stress, no indication that it had even noticed being struck by the concentrated fury of artificial stellar cores. Fascinating, Professor Yelmoth observed, her plasma form practically vibrating with academic excitement. The Voidsteel Composite's quantum dispersal matrix is redistributing the thermal energy across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The effective local temperature remains at baseline parameters despite energy inputs equivalent to controlled stellar fusion. General Krixnat's mandibles clicked with satisfaction. The Plasma Dominion's fusion technology, while impressive by primitive standards, lacks the dimensional sophistication necessary to overcome advanced coalition materials science. Their energy-based approach demonstrates fundamental limitations in their understanding of quantum mechanical engineering principles. Battle Sage Vrenkul approached next, her gravity lance humming with forces that made the station's structural support systems groan in sympathetic resonance. Her people had mastered space-time manipulation to a degree that made theoretical physicists question their career choices and occasionally their fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. She activated the lance, and local space-time briefly reconsidered its commitment to existing in a stable configuration. The weapon created gravitational shears that compressed space around the target, generating tidal forces equivalent to orbiting a neutron star at extremely close range. The attack registered as roughly equivalent to being hit by a small planet traveling at relativistic velocities. The Voidsteel target absorbed the gravitational assault with the same casual indifference it had shown the plasma blast, as if someone had politely asked it to notice that reality was attempting to fold it into a higher dimensional pretzel. Remarkable, Chief Evaluator Blextor noted with bureaucratic appreciation. The quantum dispersal matrix appears to be distributing gravitational stress through 47-dimensional channels simultaneously. The effective local spacetime curvature remains at baseline parameters despite tidal forces equivalent to close stellar mass proximity. Destroyer Mektar approached with his singularity generator, which was the sort of weapon that civilized species typically banned from use within several parsecs of populated systems. His people had long ago decided that the concept of measured response was for cultures that lacked proper commitment to problem-solving through applied physics. He activated the device, and reality briefly experienced what it might be like to be turned inside out, compressed into a point smaller than an atomic nucleus, and then asked to continue existing anyway. The localized black hole lasted for approximately 0.003 seconds before the chamber's containment systems convinced it to disperse. But during its brief existence, it generated gravitational fields that registration equipment struggled to quantify. When the sensors cleared and space-time finished settling back into its preferred configuration, the void steel target stood completely unchanged, as if the fundamental forces of the universe had personally apologized for bothering it with such a trivial inconvenience. Outstanding. General Crixnat announced with the sort of military satisfaction that came from watching enemy weapons fail spectacularly. The void steel composite has successfully negated what our instruments classify as a localized reality disruption event. The molecular integrity remains at 100% baseline parameters across all dimensional matrices. Professor Yelmoth's energy form flickered with academic triumph. The quantum dispersal system has demonstrated effectiveness against gravitational singularity formation, plasma state energy discharge, and localized spacetime manipulation. The material represents the absolute pinnacle of defensive engineering. Tobias had observed all of this with the quiet attention of someone studying a complex problem. While the aliens celebrated their materials science achievement, he'd been examining the target itself, noting details that 47 different types of quantum analysis had somehow overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant. His forest ranger training had taught him to read natural systems, to understand how forces moved through complex structures, how materials responded to stress, and how even the most robust systems had inherent patterns that determined their behavior under pressure. The void steel composite was incredibly sophisticated, but it had been manufactured according to specific principles, and those principles created predictable characteristics. The target surface showed subtle variations in texture and reflectivity patterns that became visible when you knew how to look for them. During each weapon test, these patterns had shifted slightly, revealing how the material redistributed energy and stress through its dimensional matrix. It was like reading the grain in a piece of wood, or tracking how water moved through a forest ecosystem during different weather conditions. Tobias stepped forward, his wooden javelin held with the casual competence of someone who had spent years using tools that actually worked rather than tools that impressed people at technology demonstrations. The chamber fell silent, except for the quiet hum of monitoring equipment and the barely audible sound of 3 alien species trying very hard not to laugh out loud. The human subject approaches with his organic implement, General Crixnat announced, his tone suggesting he was describing something he'd discovered in a waste processing facility. Sensor analysis confirms the weapon parameters remain unchanged from initial assessment. Professor Yelmoth added with scientific precision that barely concealed her amusement. Organic cellulose fibers, trace carbon deposits, new detectable energy enhancement systems, new quantum manipulation matrices, new dimensional interface capabilities. The technological sophistication level remains at primitive. Chief Evaluator Blextor's form pulsed with bureaucratic certainty. Classification protocols indicate a 99.97% probability of assessment failure. The human weapon lacks the basic technological requirements for meaningful interaction with void steel composite materials. Tobias ignored their commentary, focusing instead on the target. He'd identified the pattern during the previous attacks, a subtle grain that ran through the composite's dimensional matrix, visible as slight variations in how the surface reflected the chamber's lighting. It was like looking at wood, really, or reading the flow patterns in a river during different seasons. The aliens had created a marvel of materials science, layering complexity upon complexity until they'd lost track of the fundamental principles that governed their creation. They'd built something that could handle any brute force attack, any energy-based assault, any reality-disrupting weapon. But they'd built it like engineers rather than craftsmen, focusing on specifications rather than understanding the underlying structure. Tobias tested the javelin's balance, noting the weight distribution and the natural flex of the wooden shaft. The wood was Douglas fir, selected for its straight grain and consistent density, shaped according to traditional techniques that humans had been refining for millennia. He'd made it himself, following patterns that had been passed down through generations of craftsmen who understood that the best tools worked with natural forces rather than against them. "This should be highly entertaining," General Crixnat muttered to his colleagues. "The human appears to be performing some form of primitive ritual preparation." Perhaps he believes ceremonial behavior will enhance his weapon's effectiveness through supernatural intervention. Tobias took 3 measured steps backward, raised the javelin to shoulder height, and threw it with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who'd spent years learning to work with natural systems, rather than forcing technological solutions onto resistant problems. The javelin flew in a perfect arc through the chamber's recycled atmosphere, following the sort of trajectory that physics textbooks described with elegant mathematical equations. It struck the void steel target at what appeared to be a completely random point on its chest, with no more force than basic human biomechanics could generate through leverage and momentum. For a moment that seemed to stretch across geological time periods, nothing happened. The javelin stood embedded in the target's surface, looking exactly like what it was, a piece of shaped wood stuck into the most advanced material the galaxy had ever produced. The monitoring systems registered the impact as barely noteworthy, certainly nothing compared to the spectacular energy displays that had preceded it. Then, with a sound like the universe quietly clearing its throat in polite embarrassment, the void steel target cracked. Not surface damage, not a minor structural compromise that would trigger the self-repair protocols. The crack ran from the point of impact straight down through the target's core, following lines of dimensional stress that 47 different types of quantum analysis had somehow failed to detect. The quantum dispersal matrix didn't just fail, it unraveled, each failure cascading through the composite's multi-dimensional structure like dominoes falling across parallel realities. The self-repair systems tried desperately to compensate, probability manipulation fields working overtime to convince the damaged material that it had never been compromised. But the crack followed the target's fundamental structural grain, the same patterns that had been built into its quantum mechanical foundation. The repair systems found themselves trying to fix damage that existed in the basic framework they were designed to preserve. Within seconds, the most advanced defensive material the Coalition had ever created had split cleanly in half, the 2 pieces falling away from Tobias's wooden javelin with the sort of dignity that objects reserve for moments when they're trying very hard to pretend this had always been their intended function. The chamber fell silent except for the quiet settling sounds of void steel composite pieces hitting the floor and the faint whimpering noise that General Cricksnat's respiratory system was making, as it struggled to process sensory input that contradicted everything he understood about military science, physics, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. Professor Yelmoth's plasma form had gone completely still, her energy matrix apparently too shocked to maintain coherent patterns. Several of her outer manifestation layers had actually dispersed, which was the energy being equivalent of a complete nervous breakdown. Her sensors were reporting data that contradicted decades of research, centuries of theoretical development, and several fundamental assumptions about how matter behaved when properly organized. Chief Evaluator Blextor's gelatinous form was cycling through color configurations that didn't appear in any known bureaucratic protocol manual, shifting rapidly between hues that suggested confusion, panic, and the desperate need to create entirely new classification categories to accommodate impossible data. Tobias walked forward and retrieved his javelin from where it stood embedded in the chamber floor. The wooden shaft was undamaged, the fire-hardened tip as sharp as it had been before impact. He examined it briefly, with the practiced eye of someone who made his own tools, nodded in satisfaction, and turned back toward the observation platform. "Your composite material was impressive," he said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustic systems. "But you built it like engineers instead of craftsmen. All complexity, no understanding of the underlying structure. You layered quantum matrices and dimensional channels and probability manipulators until you'd created something that could handle any kind of energy-based attack." He gestured toward the fallen pieces of the target with his javelin. "But you forgot about grain. Every material has grain structural patterns that run through its entire matrix. Doesn't matter if it's wood or steel or quantum-locked composite. Find the grain, work with it instead of fighting it, and even the most advanced material will separate along its natural stress lines." General Cricksnat's mandibles were clicking in rapid, chaotic patterns that suggested his combat analysis systems were attempting to reboot themselves after encountering data that violated their basic operational parameters. That is impossible. The void steel composite exists across 47 dimensions simultaneously. It has no conventional structural patterns. It has no conventional structure at all. Tobias shrugged with the sort of casual competence that came from decades of solving practical problems. Maybe not conventional by your standards, but it had structure. I could see it in how the surface patterns shifted during those energy attacks, how the material redistributed stress through its dimensional matrix. Just like reading wood grain, really. Every piece tells you how it was made, how it wants to behave under pressure. Professor Yelmoth's energy form finally managed to stabilize enough to produce coherent communication, though it emerged as a discordant collection of frequencies that sounded like a symphony orchestra having an existential crisis. But the quantum matrices, the dimensional engineering, millennia of research and development, all built on top of the same basic patterns, Tobias replied with the patience of someone who'd spent years teaching wilderness skills to overconfident city dwellers. You can stack complexity on complexity, but if you don't understand the foundation, you're just building an elaborate structure on unstable ground. My Javelin didn't break your material through brute force. It found the stress lines you built into it and convinced it to separate along its natural boundaries. The silence that followed was the sort of profound quiet that occurs when entire civilizations suddenly realize they might have been approaching fundamental problems from completely the wrong direction for several thousand years. It was the sound of scientific paradigms cracking under the weight of wooden javelins and practical common sense. Chief Evaluator Blex Tor eventually managed to produce something resembling coherent communication, though his color patterns continued cycling through bureaucratic confusion protocols. According to, that is, our assessment parameters clearly indicate. The classification system requires. He trailed off, apparently realizing that none of his carefully prepared bureaucratic responses covered situations involving primitive wooden weapons, defeating advanced alien materials science through what appeared to be applied folk wisdom and basic pattern recognition. General Krixnat's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. His biomechanical combat analysis systems were running diagnostic routines that kept returning error messages, as if his own augmented military hardware couldn't process tactical data that contradicted everything he'd been programmed to understand about warfare and technology. The human has demonstrated technological sophistication through primitive methodology, he announced slowly, as if each word was being extracted from him with sophisticated torture equipment. This creates a fundamental classification paradox. Not really, Tobias said, leaning on his javelin like a walking stick. You've been thinking about technology backwards. You assume more complex automatically means more advanced, but that's not how it works. Real sophistication means understanding your materials well enough that you don't need complexity. The most advanced tool is the one that solves the problem with the minimum necessary intervention. He gestured around the chamber with its arrays of sensors and monitoring equipment, each piece representing centuries of technological development and astronomical resource investment. You built all this to test how much force different species could apply to your test material. But force was never the solution. Understanding was the solution. Working with natural principles instead of trying to overwhelm them with technological brute force. Professor Yelmoth's energy form was slowly beginning to stabilize again, producing tentative harmonic frequencies that suggested her worldview was attempting to reconstruct itself around entirely new fundamental assumptions. You are suggesting that our approach to materials science is fundamentally incomplete. Not incomplete, Tobias corrected gently. Just backwards. You understand the complex applications, but you've lost track of the basic principles. It's like trying to build furniture without understanding how wood actually behaves. Sure, you can force the pieces together with enough advanced engineering, but it'll never be as strong as something designed to work with the material's natural characteristics. The implications were staggering. The Coalition had built their entire technological civilization on the principle of overwhelming natural limitations through increasingly sophisticated engineering solutions. Their materials science, their energy systems, their weapons technology, all of it was based on the assumption that complexity represented advancement and that any problem could be solved by adding more exotic components. But Tobias had just demonstrated that a human with a wooden javelin could defeat their most advanced materials by understanding fundamental principles they'd overlooked in their rush toward technological sophistication. It suggested that their entire approach to scientific development might be not just inefficient, but actively counterproductive. General Krixnat's biomechanical systems finally completed their diagnostic routines and delivered their analysis in the sort of flat, emotionless tones reserved for military reports that nobody wanted to file. Assessment conclusion: human technological sophistication exceeds coalition predictive parameters through application of advanced structural analysis techniques. Classification: Tier 1 civilization with unique technological development trajectory. Recommendation: immediate integration into coalition research programs. Professor Yelmoth's harmonic voice carried frequencies that suggested a mixture of wonder, terror, and the sort of academic excitement that came from discovering that everything you thought you knew was completely wrong. We must study this approach immediately. The implications for our materials science programs are revolutionary. Chief Evaluator Blextor had apparently found a bureaucratic protocol that covered situations involving paradigm-shifting discoveries, though it was clearly designed for emergency use only. Priority communication to Coalition Central Command required. Subject: Fundamental Methodology Revision Protocols. Classification level: civilizational. What followed was perhaps the most surreal hour of Tobias's life, which was saying something, considering that his recent experiences included regular conversations with energy beings and militaristic crustaceans. The three alien observers, representatives of civilizations that had mastered interstellar travel and dimensional manipulation, began asking him detailed questions about wood grain analysis, traditional crafting techniques, and basic materials assessment through visual inspection. General Krixnat wanted to understand how manual observation could reveal structural weaknesses that quantum sensors had missed. Professor Yelmoth was fascinated by the concept of working with natural material properties rather than imposing artificial modifications through exotic energy manipulation. Chief Evaluator Blextor was frantically documenting human primitive technology assessment protocols for immediate integration into coalition evaluation procedures. The principle is actually pretty straightforward, Tobias explained, unconsciously falling into the patient instructional tone he'd used when training new forest rangers. Every material is created through specific processes that leave characteristic patterns. In wood, those patterns tell you how the tree grew, how it responded to environmental stresses, how the fibers organized themselves to handle different forces. He held up his javelin, pointing to the subtle lines visible in the wooden shaft. This piece came from a Douglas fir that grew on a steep mountain slope, constantly dealing with wind stress and gravitational loading. The grain patterns show how the tree adapted long, parallel fibers with occasional density variations, where it had to strengthen itself against specific stresses. Professor Yelmoth's energy form flickered with frequencies that suggested intense academic concentration. You are describing predictive materials analysis based on formation history and environmental adaptation patterns. This represents a sophisticated theoretical framework for understanding material behavior. It's just paying attention, Tobias replied. Your void steel composite was created the same way. You used specific fabrication techniques, specific layering protocols, specific dimensional configuration methods. Those choices created predictable stress patterns, just like tree growth creates predictable grain lines. The information was there in how the material responded during testing. You just weren't looking for it. General Krixnat's mandibles began clicking in patterns that Tobias was beginning to recognize as deep contemplation rather than agitation or amusement. The human is correct. Our monitoring systems recorded 47 different categories of sensor data during each weapons test, but we were analyzing them for energy dissipation metrics rather than structural response patterns. Because you assumed the structure was perfect, Tobias pointed out. But nothing's perfect. Everything has stress concentrations, preferred failure modes, natural boundaries where forces want to separate. The trick isn't building something without weaknesses, it's understanding where the weaknesses are and designing around them appropriately. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, with Tobias finding himself in the increasingly bizarre position of lecturing the galaxy's most advanced civilizations on basic principles of material science, structural engineering, and systematic observation. The aliens took extensive notes, asked increasingly sophisticated questions, and began developing what sounded like entirely new research programs based on human primitive analytical techniques. Eventually, Chief Evaluator Blextor's bureaucratic instincts reasserted themselves, reminding everyone that there were protocols to follow, reports to file, and classification systems to completely overhaul in light of recent discoveries. The formal assessment was complete, and Earth status had been officially upgraded from primitive species awaiting elimination to technologically sophisticated civilization with advanced analytical methodologies. But the real change went deeper than bureaucratic reclassifications. Tobias had inadvertently triggered a fundamental shift in how the Coalition approached scientific development and technological advancement. Within hours, research teams were being dispatched to study other primitive civilizations, looking for overlooked insights that might revolutionize their understanding of basic physical principles. Tobias was offered a position as Director of Natural Sciences, with a research budget that exceeded most planetary economies and access to the Coalition's most advanced laboratories. He accepted, partly because the offer included guarantees that Earth would be left to develop according to its own preferences, and partly because he'd always enjoyed teaching people how to understand the natural world around them. 6 months later, Tobias found himself in what was arguably the strangest educational facility in the galaxy, a workshop aboard Battle Station Dominion Prime, teaching alien younglings the basic principles of reading natural patterns and understanding material behavior through direct observation. His students included energy-being juveniles who communicated through controlled plasma discharges, young warriors whose exoskeletons were biological marvels of defensive engineering, and juvenile administrators whose gelatinous forms were already showing signs of advanced data processing capabilities. They gathered around workbenches, equipped with various natural materials imported from dozens of different worlds, each one learning to identify structural patterns and predict material behavior using nothing more sophisticated than careful observation and systematic analysis. "Remember," Tobias said, watching as a young Keth Mori attempted to identify stress patterns in a piece of crystalline mineral. "Every material has a story written in its structure. The atoms spent time organizing themselves according to specific principles, responding to specific forces. All that information is still there, you just have to learn how to read it." General Crix Nat observed from the back of the workshop, taking detailed notes on human pedagogical techniques and wondering how his own military education had managed to overlook such fundamental analytical principles. His species had mastered weapons that could crack planets, but somehow they'd never developed the concept of understanding materials well enough that you didn't need to crack planets. Professor Yelmoth had established monitoring equipment throughout the workshop, recording everything from acoustic patterns to quantum fluctuations, trying to understand how human primitive teaching methods produced such effective learning outcomes. Her preliminary data suggested that the combination of hands-on experience, pattern recognition training, and intuitive understanding created analytical capabilities that direct information transfer simply couldn't replicate. Chief Evaluator Blextor had integrated human observation techniques into the Coalition's standard assessment protocols, and was discovering that many previously classified primitive civilizations actually possessed sophisticated understanding of natural principles that Coalition science had overlooked. The bureaucratic implications were staggering, requiring complete revision of classification systems that had been in use for millennia. The universe, with its characteristic appreciation for cosmic irony, had arranged for the galaxy's most technologically advanced civilizations to become eager students of a forest ranger from Montana who had never wanted to leave Earth in the first place. Tobias taught them about natural patterns and material behavior, structural integrity and environmental adaptation, the patient observation required to understand complex systems through simple, systematic analysis, and in return, they taught him that sometimes the most sophisticated approach to any problem was understanding it well enough that you didn't need sophisticated solutions at all. The wooden javelin that had pierced impenetrable alien composite now rested in a place of honor in Tobias's workshop, though he occasionally took it down to demonstrate proper throwing technique to students who had mastered interstellar travel but had never learned to throw anything heavier than contained antimatter. It served as a reminder that advancement and complexity weren't always synonymous, and that sometimes the most cutting-edge technology was a pointed stick in the hands of someone who truly understood the principles behind making it work. The Supremacy Coalition had learned, much to their surprise and occasional chagrin, that supremacy didn't always require the most exotic technologies available. Sometimes it just required paying attention to the grain.